Thank you so much, Jared, for joining us on Speak Like a Leader, Not a Boss podcast. I am so excited to be talking to you about leadership, speaking like a leader, and your leadership experiences. So, a huge welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you, Nausheen. This is special for me. When I had the opportunity to watch your TEDx talk, you and I have chatted a little bit about this, but it definitely resonated for me because, I have traveled a similar path in my life. So I just have to applaud your courage in stepping out and showing so much vulnerability. It makes me really excited about where you're going to take all your current endeavors because clearly you're a thoughtful person who is seeking to understand herself. And I think, as we talk through some of the leadership points today, then you'll realize how critical I believe that is for someone to be an effective leader. So I first just want to applaud you on your current path and thank you for giving me time to share some of my stories. And I'll also say, by the way, thank you to your listeners. Maybe there will be watchers at some point. I'm not sure how exactly you're going to choose to frame all this out. But, leadership is not for the faint-hearted, nor is public speaking. So it's important to realize that, those things are easy to kind of sit back and criticize. You can almost make a sport of it, but you don't really have any credibility in critiquing until you've stepped into the arena. So hopefully your listeners take this as a charge to find a way to lead, find a way to speak. That's how you're going to find your voice as a leader, as a speaker. And it's really a call to action for getting out there and making it happen. And then you can be a more credible critic of leaders who have frustrated you or who are currently frustrating you or who will frustrate you in the future. Because again, it's not easy work, I would suggest. So thank you, Nausheen, and thank you to all your listeners.
Thanks so much. That was a great intro to get us started, and thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
And yeah, you touched upon basically the heart of this podcast, the way I see it, because it's not about leadership, it's not about communication, it's about communicating as a leader, which is a very specific skill set that is possibly, I like to think, is possibly the most important skill set that a leader should have. And not just in terms of talking with their team, but just talking to people in general, talking to people outside of their company, representing their company, or speaking to their own management. Before we get into it, I'd love for you to do an intro about your super interesting and unique journey, especially how you became a leader and all the different places and people and teams that you've led over the years. I'd love to know.
Yeah, you bet. I'll try to make it the short version and hit the highlights for you. I kind of, for some of your listeners, it could be interesting context, but I grew up in a really small town in America that would be considered rural. I went directly into the Air Force, into the academy from there. And that started my time in the Air Force. The academy is interesting because it's a kind of 4-year lockstep program, but you're effectively leading from almost day one, certainly within your first year, and it's a leadership immersion in many ways. So you're surrounded by some of the best of the country, and other countries as well who send exchange cadets. And the topics are always about leadership and how do you lead more effectively and what are the pitfalls and how do you avoid those. So it's a constant front of mind for me from the time certainly that I entered into the service. From there, I had the opportunity to train to be a fighter pilot. I flew the F-16, that was my bird. I flew in Germany, Korea. I had the opportunity to participate in a lot of different exercises and operations, whether in the Middle East or all across Europe, and then many stateside assignments where I had the opportunity to build different skill sets along the way, or train others as an instructor to build those skill sets as well. So that sort of helped me find a voice as an instructor, as someone who guided others. In the Air Force, it's interesting. It's kind of like if a professional kind of a sports team chose some of the strongest players to go be the coach. For better or for worse, the Air Force kind of takes the folks who are performing the best in that very highly technical role of flying, to challenge them with leadership positions, like more executive roles. So I had the opportunity to roll into operations director type positions in a few different places, chief of staff positions of like 4,000 member organizations. And I ultimately had the opportunity to lead about a 250 person organization with 14 different facilities spread around 6 different kind of departmental functions, responsible for really handling an airfield and all the safe comings and goings along with that, along with helping an entire wing, so 3 combat squadrons of F-16 flyers, be prepared to go out and fight. So that was a really exciting leadership role. And from there, I went into the Pentagon, where I had the opportunity to work in what's called security cooperation. So I was guiding the development of Air Force policy positions that had to do with export of goods and services to our partners and allies. So it was really awesome work to kind of dig in and figure out, like, how do we deliver the most capability to help our partners and allies handle this. And it's not just a one-dimensional look. It's very much a question of, what do they have the capability to operate, the budget to operate, the current skill sets to kind of absorb this technology. So it has to be a very thoughtful process in terms of how you actually deliver goods and services, so that you don't deliver a super high-tech capability that ends up just sitting on the airport ramp and not ever turning a wheel. The piece I missed in there that will probably be of interest to you and some other folks is I had 2 years in the embassy in India, where I was working as kind of a representative to the Indian Air Force and helping them connect back to the U.S. government to help them outfit their forces with equipment and training. Again, kind of the goods and services that they needed to be more effective in the future. And that assignment was incredible. We ran a few different competitions in those years. So I had the opportunity to explore so many parts of India. And the way they did their competitions was to try to put platforms in the most austere, harshest environments. So we would go anywhere from up in the Himalayas, up in Leh, kind of the Jammu and Kashmir region, out to Jaisalmer in the hot desert. Speaking of high temperatures, as we were discussing before, into the kind of jungle, humid temperatures of Bangalore, or Bengaluru, as it's being called now. So it's just a fantastic opportunity to travel around and experience cultures. So I'd say that's the snapshot of sort of my career trajectory. Once I exited the Air Force, I've taken some time to basically lean in on some development. So push pause, do some recharge, reconnect with family, and build those internal relationships. And I've just come around to starting up my Arlandria Consulting, so that I have the opportunity to share the knowledge I've gained, the leadership skills, the program management skills, and the process improvement with NGOs or corporations in order to help them do their work more people more effectively. So I've just gotten that off the ground, and yeah, I've got 1,000 other passions beyond those things, but that's kind of the arc of where my leadership journey has taken me until today. So thanks for the question.
Oh, it's incredible. We've talked about your experience a few times now, but every time I hear you talk about it, it's just mind blowing, really. Just kind of thinking about all the places you've been, all the interesting and fascinating things that you've done. Very fascinating from an outsider's perspective, for sure. So much of what you've done is kind of, in that realm of things that are glamorized, talked about, and mediatized in so many different ways. So it's just fascinating talking to someone who's been on the inside, doing all these things that we just kind of hear about. And it's also very fascinating to me to think about how you've had so much experience in India. And I've never been to India, even though my roots are Indian, but just never couldn't go, haven't been yet, maybe someday. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting to hear you talk about that, and like to hear about the extent to which you've actually explored the country. That's pretty cool. During all that time, when you think back about, this was like, I'm thinking this was like about 20 odd years, right? More than 20 years of experience in the Air Force, and all put together.
That's right.
So looking back over more than 20 years of experience, and specifically when it comes to communicating, can you think of a moment where you realized for the first time that you're not simply speaking as yourself, as Jared anymore, you're speaking as a leader? Was there ever that, what I calling a flip switch moment, where you flip the switch from being a manager, a boss, an employee, just a person, to stepping up as a leader in terms of talking to people?
Yeah, interesting question. I think in some ways I would challenge the assumption behind the question, which is the notion that it's a natural progression to go from manager to leader. So what I would suggest is that, and this will be a huge takeaway for folks who are interested in strengthening their leadership skills, but you can lead from any position in an organization. And it's so critical to understand that. I've, irrespective of the roles I've been in, like, I hope I was leading long before I was in a management role, because that would be indicative that I was actually looking at the challenges within an organization and helping to propose solutions to those challenges, and engaging in a thoughtful way with the people in that organization who had the authority to implement those changes. And I would suggest that that is leadership. So if you have anyone who's making their voice heard, they are potentially leading in an organization, even if they're in what would be considered like hierarchically a lower role. I don't know if this story translates. Are you familiar with the story of like the emperor's new clothes?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It sounds like you have a really wide audience. So the 40-second version is, there's an emperor who loves to be well clad. He seeks the finest tailor in the kingdom, or in the empire, I guess it would be, and brings that tailor in. But the emperor is a tyrant, right? If he doesn't like something, he kills somebody. So the tailor, as many tailors in these old tales are, is very wise, and he basically crafts nothing and calls it the most beautiful clothes in the world. And if you are truly wise and loyal to the kingdom, you'll see how beautiful these clothes are. And the emperor steps to the mirror and he's completely naked.
Yeah.
And he goes, oh, well, my goodness, these clothes are beautiful. I can't wait to go parade them around the city. And if anybody speaks out against me, they'll feel the heat of my sword. And he parades down the street, and all the people cheer. And finally, a little boy basically points and says, "The emperor has no clothes." So it's the voice of the little boy is the only one who's speaking truth, the only one who's actually talking about the reality of the situation. Like I've seen that happen in organizations. So you can lead from any level. The voice of reason can come from any level. So it's really important to kind of key in on that. I'd say, it's a journey to the spirit of your question. I don't know that there was a particular moment that was a turning point for me, because as you journey, you're always getting inputs as to whether and how you communicate and whether that's effective. So one of the things I think I learned over time is if you're going to be in a leadership role, you have to be very careful, for instance, with humor, particularly sarcasm.
Oh, yeah.
Because sarcasm just doesn't translate. And, my peers would understand that I have one of the darkest senses of humor, and it could just be grittily sarcastic and just so biting in a way that just makes everyone go, oh, and then laugh. But that doesn't work in a leadership role. So I think that's just an important note to realize. Like you continually have to look at yourself and which parts of yourself you bring to the table. And sometimes things aren't going to translate. In terms of, is it the little boy leading in an organization or is it the emperor? I'd say some qualities that they would have to have would be integrity, moral courage, and you and I have talked about this a bit, but also empathy or understanding. Like if a manager doesn't have those things, moral courage, integrity, empathy, then they risk being either a failed leader or never becoming a leader, irrespective of what role they have in the organization. And probably, especially as you kind of think more in executive terms, I think it's important to talk about like transformational leadership qualities. And I would suggest that those would be along the lines of listening, which is, a cousin of empathy. The ability to effectively navigate change is absolutely critical as you step into a leadership role. So having the language and the voice and the strategy for being able to navigate change in an organization, because every organization will face change. Creating a vision, that's something that a leader must do that a manager doesn't necessarily have to do. A manager can keep the train on the tracks and keep them running on time, and the manager has succeeded in their role. But a leader needs to have some vision of where the organization is going to go over time and how to take the organization there. It's important to note that a leader needs to be able to build coalitions amongst diverse stakeholders to achieve the mission. You kind of pointed this out up front, and this is where the communication piece is going to intersect maybe, because those coalitions are going to be internal, external, above, below, every direction, and there are going to be naysayers within those coalitions. But a leader needs to be able to create the foundation of trust and build common ground so that you can move forward together. Culture, that comes from a leader. There's some incredible examples out there about culture that really speak to what one person at the top setting a culture for an entire organization can do over time. And then you have the culture of the organization reacting to situations before the leader can. I think, one of the most powerful examples folks could look up is when there was some poison found in Tylenol in the 80s. It was like cyanide or something like that. And the CEO was on a plane when this was determined. But before he had landed, his organization had made the determination to recall like every bottle of Tylenol, which is like a painkiller, acetaminophen, for folks who may not speak Tylenol. But that's a huge decision, right? Like, you think that's a company that says this doesn't fit our morals, our values. We're not going to let one person get hurt by something that's on a shelf with our name. And I think you can contrast that. There's a great article out there that contrasts it against why Volkswagen had the issue where they cheated to pass emissions tests. Even they basically, the engineers engineered a chip solution to have the car run at a lower emissions level when it was being tested and hooked up to the testing machines. But as soon as you unplugged that, it ran for performance, which some people would say, oh, that's really nifty engineering, but it's a demonstration of a complete lack of integrity in a culture. And that starts at the top. I'll say building trust. That's the other kind of critical thing. A leader has to build trust in an organization, because all those things we just talked about, navigating change, creating a vision and moving it forward, building a culture, like the foundation for that is trust. So I think those are some of the qualities that I would kind of key into that help distinguish whether someone is managing or leading.
That's great. I love that answer. We talked about the emperor and the little boy, and I think it really speaks to the organization, whether the person in charge is the emperor or the little boy. And I liked that you called it the voice of reason, and many would call it the voice of dissent, because that's what the little boy was doing. He wasn't, following orders, and he wasn't buying into the collective imagination.
Exactly.
So it's definitely the organizations where the voice of dissent can be heard and valued and respected that are amazing organizations, but also very rare. I often feel that, very often we engage in a lot of dialogue. Both of us are very active on LinkedIn, for example, and we often engage in this dialogue where we're talking about all these qualities of leaders and these organizations that we would love to see and build. And then you talk to people that are actually in organizations kind of like struggling away, and they say that, you're just talking about a utopia that doesn't exist, because the reality of the world is that, the emperor is the one who's in charge for most organizations. I also really liked how you kind of laid out the different qualities that a leader should have. Absolutely, moral courage, integrity, empathy. And for me, the reason why I'm so passionate about communication is, for me, communication is the way that the leader can basically bring these skills to life. It almost doesn't, it doesn't really make an impact if the leader has integrity and courage, and they're caught in the midst of a toxic system where they are not able to communicate with that integrity and courage, and they have to kind of use the same ways of communication that everyone else is using. Then whether or not they have integrity and courage or empathy kind of becomes meaningless. It's the same for having a vision. You have that vision, but then how do you communicate that vision in a way that your team makes that vision their own and doesn't just think of it as like an order coming from the top that they have to just follow, right? So it's
really insightful, Nausheen. I would say when you're in a leadership role, for me, I found that getting feedback that was unvarnished was challenging, because few people want to bring bad news to the CEO level in an organization. At least I will say organizations I took over. So it was imperative for me to step in really early on and demonstrate that every single person had a voice and concerns were going to be taken seriously. We had the opportunity to do basically an organizational feedback session. I'd seen those conducted, many times before in different organizations with, different levels of seriousness, I would say. But one of the things I had as an opportunity was like, I could input 3 questions on there. And it basically, I try to create open-ended questions that would allow people to vent or put their frustrations or point out like, what's the thing I'm missing or what's the thing that leadership is missing, and invited via an anonymous survey criticism. And here's how I approached it when we got the results in. Number one, like the results were mostly glowing, but I didn't want to focus on the fact that they were mostly glowing. I wanted to give credence to the folks who had taken time to write complaints. So I pulled in every single member of the organization in about 6 different meetings or whatever, and walked them through the comments and the themes that people gave. And I put stuff up, on the giant board that was really charged to include, maybe strong language and those types of things. And I used that to say, so here's someone that loves it. Here's someone that doesn't love it. I believe we have inconsistent middle management. That's a trend I'm seeing. So, I gave the opportunity for the organization to share their voice and their concerns with me. And I used their voice and their concerns to be able to get after a gap in leadership development that I felt like we had. I coached kind of a tiger team through figuring out how do we get after developing that. And we basically created a monthly get together. We pulled in sister organizations from across the base and gave them the opportunity to build up as well. I created an opportunity for the kind of senior middle managers to take responsibility for the development of the younger middle managers. So everyone had stake in this. Everyone understood it was part of their role and mission to help those first line supervisors develop their skill sets. So, we could talk about change management, but I used some of those principles to effectively be able to implement an entire leadership program that spread out across the entire kind of group, if you will, and had 200 or 300 participants that it impacted on a monthly basis. And so, part of that, I'll say, you talked about communication as one of the most important critical things that a leader can do. I would suggest that communication is always in service of something. So developing your people is top of what a leader can do in many ways. It's definitely toward the top of the list. That's the investment you're making in the organization. That's the investment you're making in the welfare of the people of the organization after you walk out the door. So, one of the kind of really cool ideas in the Air Force is you always want to leave a unit stronger than it was when you arrived, in a better place, with better morale, with more effective mission readiness. That's one of the goals. And you want to set your successor up for success. And I'm not sure that translates always into the corporate environment where folks could change jobs every 6 months or something, right? But there's a real sense of ownership when you've stepped into a leadership position in the Air Force that I think is important fundamentally for a leader to have if they're going to be effective in a role. And it kind of goes to that long-term health of the organization. So that's just some thoughts about, your sort of idea about feedback and such, and how critical it is to get feedback, but it's also not easy. In my 2 years there, I had an anonymous Dropbox that I think got 2 inputs in it across the 2-year period, like, for a little handwritten note. Maybe it was just 1, but I think it was 2. And that's not a lot, right?
And this was anonymous.
Yeah, totally anonymous.
So what do you think prevented people from using it?
I think it's there's no one thing, right? It's that folks aren't necessarily, it could be as simple as folks aren't in that building, right? So, if I went back in time, I would set up some anonymous, survey monkey or something that was always available that folks could log into and put an input. And I think some of my successors actually approached it that way, which I think is, anytime you can give people access from where they are, especially as you transition to a remote universe, that's really critical.
I loved what you said about, leaving your team stronger than you found them, stronger than when you arrived. And the way that you're talking about leadership, inclusion, empathy, building a feedback loop, it all sounds really positive. And it's very, honestly, I would say it's very surprising for me to hear, because the way that I always imagined, the military, the Air Force, any part of the military really is in a very different way. Perhaps it's just because I'm an outsider, and probably also the fact that, I identify more as a hippie, with a healthy skepticism of authority and structures. It's just how I've always been. I think also coming from that background, so it's almost in a way super positive, like too positive. I completely, I totally believe all the things that you're telling me about. I'm just wondering, were you the exception to the rule? Was it not? Is leadership and communication in the military in general, is it not very regimented? Does it not have to follow very strict rules? Is it not geared necessarily towards empowering different voices that might disagree? Is that not it? Like, are we, like, on the outside, are we just getting a completely different view of what it's actually like on the inside?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll try to approach it in a way that your hippie self will appreciate. No, I think part of this, it's a few things. There's a generational element, I would suggest, that when you look at the leaders who were at the top when I came in, 20 odd years ago to the Air Force, when I entered, they were very much from the great man theory of leadership school. They were less collaborative. They were less interested in, I would suggest they were less interested in dissenting opinions, back to your point. And, leadership, the understanding of leadership, like the constant evaluation of how we become better leaders, how do we improve? Like over time, that's just made I'll speak for Air Force leaders, but I assume it's across all services, has made them better, more effective leaders. Certainly in the Air Force, there's not much kind of charge the hill leadership where I need you to run up that hill with your gun while you're getting shot at. It's interesting in some senses, because the folks who are generally put in harm's way are the most highly trained, officer level individuals who are crossing the line into a place where they're going to get shot at. So it's a little different than other services, I would say, is part of that equation as well. And then I don't think I'm the exception. I think when I look at leaders who, like the generations who follow behind me, they'll have more of this approach. And I think it's because we learn, we grow as people, as a population, as organizations. And the Air Force, as I pointed out, like from day one at the academy, like you're talking about leadership in a really smart, meaningful, nuanced way that just doesn't happen outside of that type of space. So, you could take someone who's just stepped away from a 4-year degree there, and they could lead a leadership workshop anywhere in the world practically, because they've already lived a lot of that. And they've talked about it and really thought in smart ways about it. Your question of exception is so curious to me, Nausheen, because I would ask myself the same thing. And I would think the thing that sprung into my mind as I heard you ask it is, for me, the bad leader, if you can use that term, bad leader, the ineffective leader maybe is more appropriate. The ineffective leader is the exception to the rule when you look at and the Air Force environment. It's not unprecedented, but it's the exception to the rule. And I would say such that the further you go up the chain, like some stories are going to be public stories of toxic leaders at the general level, like 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star. Like those people are somehow going to slip through the system. And it's almost criminal that they would, because you see like what the pool is that's being drawn from. There's no excuse for someone to arrive at that level and not have the awareness of what they're doing is toxic. But it's also populated by humans, right? Like the Air Force, other services are human beings that have human tendencies. I would say the one thing that I would love to shift about how the Air Force does its work that would help out a lot is I would implement some type of 360 feedback system, even if it weren't used initially to determine whether someone were promotable to the next grade. But what lacks now is that, someone can get they can have something good happen. They can get a halo put on their head. And then from that point forward, they can do almost no wrong. And maybe they just don't have the opportunity to grow as a leader in the meantime. So you end up with someone in a leadership position who just doesn't have the managerial skill sets to accomplish that. And I realize we're talking about leadership, right? But wow, I've had, you could just as easily be a toxic leader for lacking managerial skills as you could for lacking integrity. So I wouldn't dismiss those kind of like more gritty managerial skills that need to be in place to get stuff done and to understand the moving parts and pieces of an organization. So, yeah, I don't know that I'm the exception. It's hard. It would be hard for me to say that. Certainly, you could ask someone I work with, maybe they would have a perspective on it. But I'm me. And that's who I try to bring to a leadership role. And I want to be in the role of a servant to the people and remove obstacles for them. So that suits me and my personality. And if every person's different, so everyone's going to bring their own skill set to a leadership role. So I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it does. It does. I think the part that you said about bad or ineffective leaders perhaps being the exception and still kind of slipping through the cracks, it really resonates. I've been a part of several organizations, companies that overall seem to have a positive culture, and there's one guy or like some people like just like in a minority that really kind of create toxicity for their teams, and then that kind of spreads outwards like a virus, and it's very difficult to address it, even if you, for example, go to HR. I've had like firsthand experience of this. I've gone to HR and like tried to talk about this senior manager who I think isn't creating the right work culture. And this is in a place where the HR is very open and very interested in hearing about feedback. And yet they've been powerless because they're like, this guy is technically not breaking any rules. He's a senior manager. It's just that the behavior that he has, the mannerisms or the things that he says, are just, they're not creating the best environment. But this, like, I was literally in a room with an HR person who's just telling me that I don't really know how I can help you. So I've experienced that and understood that it is always possible for ineffective / bad leaders to slip through the cracks, even in the best of organizations. So that makes a lot of sense. And that, brings me to the next question, which is, I want to kind of go more like deeper into communication and ask you if you can think of, or if you've come across, you must have, in your time there working with so many different kinds of people, have you come across people that have just been really terrible at communicating, just really haven't been able to be effective, be impactful, put their thoughts across in a meaningful way? And have you seen that affect their work?
For me, ineffective communication would start with not listening. There's plenty of people, probably the most common thing you would see is someone who shows up to a meeting and just wants to speak so that their voice is heard in the meeting, but they don't actually say anything. In my last position, one of my peers, as he was walking out the door at his kind of farewell ceremony, he pointed back at me and said, Jared, you say more with fewer words than any human I've ever met. So for me, I took that as a great compliment because it fits who I'm trying to be, right? If you're going to speak in an environment in a leadership role, just understand why you're speaking. Understand what the purpose of the meeting is. There are times to brainstorm. There are times to think out loud. And it's important to know if you work for a leader who's thinking out loud, because they might explore the entire set of options moving forward. And if you've only listened into one piece of that, you might bite off on the wrong thing and do the wrong thing. But I would offer oftentimes the most effective communicators are going to be those who step in. They've already thought through what they want to communicate. They've also thought through what they want to brainstorm and frame as such, so that when you're talking, you understand what's happening. I've seen leaders who just didn't put the basic kind of initial thought in, and then didn't understand that every time they changed positions, the rest of the organization was just like on the end of a whip. One of my peers at that time said, I'm going to wait a week before I follow any of his guidance, because so long, none of his guidance has lasted half that long. So that's ineffective management, right? Like it's coming across as communication because he keeps giving direction that counters what he's just said. And that's just not helpful at all. I would say oftentimes it can be, just not listening. I was in an organization in Germany where the kind of, CEO role of our organization knew everything. He was never wrong. And, pity upon the soul who tried to convince him that he could grow or adjust some thought. And by the way, a lovely human being. Like, I'd love to sit down and have a beer with him at any time. However, in that role, he was very much the great man theory of leadership kind of generation. So when the director of operations of that organization began countering all of the CEO's guidance, as soon as the CEO walked out of the room, nobody pointed out to the CEO. So now you've got a broken organization because the two people at the top are giving completely opposite direction from one another. And ultimately, it ended up in some safety issues, like some significant safety of flight issues, where some poor decisions were made. The director of operations was fired. And the CEO was dumbfounded that no one had brought any of these concerns to his attention. He never created the trust or the conditions for someone to bring him any type of bad news. So yeah, is it that the words he said were bad? No, it's that he didn't listen. So that was his communication failure, I would offer. And he assumed that he had to have the answer to everything, which I just don't think is a healthy assumption for someone who leads a complex organization, particularly if you have really smart people working for you.
Listening is definitely, I mean, if I know I said at the beginning, communication is underrated. If that, I mean, in that case, like listening, like no one even thinks of it as a skill that they need to build, other than the people who actually do, who train themselves and who take it very seriously. But by and large, a lot of people don't think of listening as something that they need to really develop and cultivate. And listening can be impactful and can be used through so many ways. Like, for example, like you said, you don't necessarily need to be the person who is listening to everyone. You could use your team to create that feedback loop. You could have those anonymous boxes where you can have people give you feedback. It's about creating that culture. That, again, you said, it's about creating that culture from the top, where you create a culture of listening and openness and feedback, where people actually feel like what they say will be heard, what they say will be valued, and perhaps could even be acted upon. Perhaps what they say can actually be translated into a strategy or into action. And it's when
100%.
Yeah. And it's when the leader isn't actually listening, and when they're just kind of singing their own tune, is when people just feel like they need to just be in execution mode all the time, just be the executors of these orders. And I'm talking like just in general, like for any organization. And I've been in a lot of organizations or teams like that, unfortunately, where it's just the leader giving those orders, and what you say or what you have to think about them might not always matter, and that. And it's very disempowering for sure. It doesn't feel good to be in an environment like that. And in terms of, you mentioned we've been talking about all these qualities that leaders should have, and that leaders should communicate and show pretty much I would say in a proactive way. Have you had a progression at any point where you've thought about the traits that you have as a person, and which of those traits should you be building upon to create, like, going from Jared the person to Jared the leader, and how you're going to be using them to communicate in a specific way? And I can kind of probably ask you this question in a more concrete way. You've led a number of trainings, for example. We talked about that earlier. So when you start a training, do you step into a different persona? Do you speak a specific way so that your words are going to be more impactful or heard better, understood better?
I don't know that I've been deliberate ever in that way. I try to be myself as much as I can, almost irrespective of where I am in the world. Going to the grocery store or in a leadership role, training. But I mean, your question is good, because it's kind of the Shakespearean, all the world's a stage. Each of us is acting in some way every minute of the day. So how do I do it different? How do I present myself differently? I really think on the whole, I try to bring myself, the appropriate portions of myself to that engagement. And hopefully by doing so and demonstrating a certain, human approach, I create some level of connection. And once there's a connection made, then you have the opportunity to build on a conversation. In a training environment, like I would like for it to be a conversation, because I've been in the seat of being trained. And if it's just someone standing up talking, it can be death by PowerPoint. And the real learning happens when conversations begin to unfold about really complex issues. I would say that depending on what I'm offering, depending on what I'm leading or where I'm presenting, sometimes it's useful to just recognize that your words potentially have more impact, and you have the opportunity to set a tone. So I think I try to be, to the spirit of your question, I try to be more deliberate about what tone I might set, or what signals I might set, kind of about the organization or what we care about. Like in my last role, I set up kind of a leadership development weekly, where we would get together, and that quickly kind of spread where our sister divisions started to kind of like lean into it and participate as well, because it just started to get a little bit of a buzz. And one of the things I did was try to reach out to someone who was relatively new. She was Black, so from a historically underserved community, whether that be via race or gender. So I made a deliberate point of having her come in and brief the group. But before I did that, I asked her, what do you, like, with the whole group on the phone, what do you really want to go by? Because I hear everyone saying your name as this, but this is what I see written above your desk. And she pronounced her name, and she said, that's how I would like to be referred to. So from that day forward, me recognizing that I could send subtle signals, that I could demonstrate what's important in our organization, I acknowledged her lived experience, her space, her name, and everybody else by default had to do the same thing. So maybe it's just being aware that the words you speak matter, and that they could carry extra weight, and use your powers for good, if that makes sense.
The words you speak definitely matter. Yeah. You're so right. And then you always remember things like that. I think if you're on the receiving end, I'm pretty sure this lady remembers this gesture. I certainly, I remember the positive and negative things that have that have to do with how it's made me feel in the moment, which is like, a result of how someone's communicated with me. And there are things that I've carried with me for, 15 or 20 years. And it's very impactful, just having that small, like making a small gesture, which is so meaningful, of, asking someone how they want to be addressed, making sure your language is inclusive. I think I don't know if you talked about this earlier, but I'm learning French, and I just had a conversation with my teacher today about the French language and how it's evolving to be more inclusive. You probably know that French is very gendered, right? It's more gendered than other languages. So, and now there's a whole movement to kind of make sure that the female gender is more recognized and included everywhere. And it's a huge subject of debate. But language is powerful. Language shapes our thoughts, shapes our experiences, shapes the way that we see the world. If you don't have a word for something, it's actually hard for you to conceptualize it. And that's why sometimes you can't translate things from one language to another, because, the experiences, the lived experiences of people from different cultures are so different. So absolutely, yeah, I agree with that. It's in communication again. It's about, for sure, the content and the delivery, and sometimes they're equally important. Sometimes one is more important than the other. But this definitely reminds me of what you said earlier about someone commenting that you're saying a lot with very little, which is definitely a very powerful thing. If someone's observed that about you, it really means that, for me, it means that you've been historically paying a lot of attention to both your content and your delivery in that way. So it brings me to my last question. Do you remember the first few times that you had to address a group of people, especially as a leader in a leadership position? And were you nervous? Was your heart beating fast? Do you remember that time? Was it a time where you had to kind of overcome any kind of, I don't know, stage fright or nerves? And how did you do that?
That's a good question. I think, well, I don't know how far back I'd have to rewind to find the first time I ever addressed a group as a leader. I think even if I went back 20 some odd years, I was just being myself in that space. And trying to do all the things I just described to you, really, in many ways. I was lucky. I came up in a school that had some good arts programs. We called it forensics, which I don't know if it gets called that in other regions. But it basically, one of the things I had the opportunity to do was get up and present, say, a poem or do improvisational speaking, where I would be given a list of 3 topics in 25 minutes and have to come in and give a 5-minute speech as part of a competition. I had leadership roles in student government and in any number of kind of things that helped prepare me for public speaking. I was in the choir, that put me in front of an audience in a way that, even though I was surrounded by people, it at least lets you deal with some of those nerves. So yeah, I'm not beyond, I would say, getting nervous today about presenting. If it's new, if it's an environment that I'm not used to, like, I think of this, I've addressed groups in person 1,000 times, but when I had an assignment to Baghdad, I was there for 6 or 7 months. I transitioned into kind of basically remote masters, and I was linked to the group that was in San Diego, actually performing in class. And I remember having to call in for a presentation, like under the stairs of this strategic operations center that was inside of a presidential palace, inside of the international zone. And my voice was shaking, I realized, because I was nervous to be presenting on the phone. And I'm like, why in the world am I nervous? Like, I'm getting shot at, twice a week here. And I'm not, my voice isn't shaking then, but here I am on the phone trying to present, and I can't see the audience and I don't know what their reaction is. And somehow I feel nervous. So yeah, I think just the real kind of take some deep breaths, make sure you're well hydrated going into some type of presentation. If you can get like a mindful moment, 30 seconds, a minute with your eyes closed, thinking about nothing. And, I go back to I had the opportunity to give an address at my high school graduation, and my brother attended, and he asked me, like, man, aren't you so nervous to get up and speak? And I remember I answered him, I'm like, not really, because like everybody out there wants me to do well. Nobody wants me to fail. And that may or may not be true, right? But I certainly believed it. And I think, there's going to be one jerk in the crowd of a few hundred people. Odds on there's probably 20 jerks. But for the most part, like everybody wants you to succeed. They want you to do well. So yeah, you just step up there and do your thing. Try to get yourself in just sort of a more relaxed space so you can be yourself and then do your thing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it tells me that you've had a lot of exposure to public speaking from a very young age, and you've probably overcome those fears at a young age. But the strategies that you talk about to counter those nerves, they absolutely work. Finding your zone before going on stage. That's definitely something I do a lot of, and it totally works for me. And it's interesting you talked about the lack of feedback making you more nervous, making you nervous in a way that you weren't expecting. And I've experienced that, and I've seen people really feel like they're out of their depth when they're talking to a camera versus talking to a group of people. Like they could be talking to 10 or 20 or 30 people and they're going to be fine. And the moment they're talking to a camera where there isn't a person at the other end anymore, if they have to, like create a video, present themselves, do a keynote, be filmed for something, they just suddenly they lose that part of their personality that just thrives on feedback and interaction and kind eyes and nodding heads and smiles, which they're used to seeing. So I can really see how that it would really have an impact. This one time I actually had to deliver a webinar. This company had asked me to do a webinar for them, and it was the oddest platform where I could only see myself and my presentation. I could not see the audience. I could not even interact with the audience. I had no idea if they were there. I had to just log on and deliver like an hour-long presentation, looking into the green dot and smiling and assuming there are people there. And I had my team join the webinar as guests, and they were like, yeah, there are like 300 people here. It's amazing. And I was like, why aren't they letting me see that? I would be really happy knowing that there are people watching, so that I know I'm not just talking to myself. So bizarre experience. I can't even imagine. I mean, the way you're describing it, talking, like presenting over a phone, probably something that doesn't happen anymore with Zoom and such. But it sounds very interesting, very novel.
I bet it does happen, right? I mean, part of it is just being flexible and feeling prepared with your material. And then, whatever method by which you present is just going to be that. It's a tool at that point.
Yeah, true. Knowing what you can use as a tool. I also enjoyed, when you mentioned that the audience is on your side and they want you to win. And that is absolutely true for every context other than stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
Sadly, in stand-up comedy, it just brings out the worst in the audience, and I don't know why that is.
Have you tried stand-up comedy?
I have. Wow. I have thankfully not been like booed off the stage, but I've actually been in the audience when there's been someone else performing stand-up, and they made a joke about something. I can't even remember what it was about, but it was clearly something that was a little bit controversial at the time. And this person made the joke, and someone in the audience yelled out, "That's not funny." And this poor person who was on stage, turned out that this was their first gig, and they had just gotten the courage, and it was like an open mic, I think. So they had just gotten the courage to like get up there, like do their material, and it completely disarmed this person. They were just not used to
Yeah.
this kind of the crowd like harassing them. And eventually it came to a point where this person just kind of lost track of what they were saying. The organizer had to come on the stage and like say, like, guys, you're here to listen to this person, or to listen to people. If you disagree with something, you can leave. No one's stopping you. No one's forcing you to sit. But you can't disrespect people when they're on the stage. So since then, I've realized, like, all right, cool. So there are some exceptions. But by and large, yeah, the audience is on your side. They want you to win. They're not gonna be they're not gonna want you to fail. They're not gonna want to challenge you. And
Yeah, I
that
think
helps.
and even if stand-up comedy, that's a pressure cooker. Because you're right, like there's going to be most places there's going to be alcohol flowing freely, inhibitions will have been dropped, and inhibitions drop and mouths open, so it can quickly turn into a hostile audience. But in some ways, I think that comedians are probably like one of the best things you could watch to learn how to deliver a message, because the ones who do it well can deliver it so artfully, and then also it just exposes this truth that you're forced to stare at. I mean, I think for me, comedians are the truth tellers of our time, of our generation. I think probably they always have been, like kind of the idea of the court gesture.
Delivering the harsh truths to the royalty.
Absolutely. And, I think I look at a Ricky Gervais or a Dave Chappelle, and they're always ruffling feathers, but it's because they're touching topics that are hot topics, and they're holding a mirror up to people. That's why they're ruffling feathers. And I think it's just, in an alternate universe, I would be up on a stage somewhere delivering some comedic piece, at the risk of being canceled. And I've never heard a comedian interviewed who didn't bomb at some point.
Oh yeah.
So I think that's probably useful for your listeners to hear. Like, not every swing is going to be a home run, to use a baseball analogy. I don't know what the cricket equivalent is. Not every swing is going to knock down a wicket. I don't know.
But a six. Not every hit of the bat is going to be a sixer or a six.
That's the back and forth sixer.
Well, no, the back and forth is a run. Oh my god, I did not think I was going to talk cricket this evening. A six is the highest you can score. So it's when the ball goes over, like just kind of literally goes out of the stadium.
So that's the home run equivalent for sure.
Yeah, that's the home run equivalent.
Yeah. So I think not every swing is going to be a sixer, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because it's a learning process. And I think as you kind of talked about early on, or maybe we just hinted at, like, maybe it was just me praising your path, but you are looking internally in a way that I think every presenter has to, every leader has to. First, you must know yourself. And that's what's going to give you the opportunity to meet your team members halfway. If you don't know yourself, then you're just sort of flapping in the breeze, and you're not going to be stability when your team needs stability. So, yeah, absolutely. Like, on your journey to knowing yourself, you're going to stub your toe, you're going to slip and fall. Just stand back up and go to school on what you could have done better.
Yeah. That's a really powerful way to end the episode. Not knowing whether the ball that you're hitting is going to be a home run or not, and being able to bounce back from that regardless, and being able to really accept that and get on with the show, whether it's in the moment. So we talked about, the fact that maybe humor doesn't always translate very well, and maybe you're on a stage and you've delivered a joke and it's fallen flat and there's no laughs, and you're not going to get the award for the funniest person alive, and you still need to go on, and you still need to get back from that and get back in your element. Or whether, of course, it's something way more serious, like a military strategy not working out, and just kind of figuring out how to bounce back from that. I can't even imagine what that would be like, but you've lived through that, so I'm sure it's easier said than done, but it's definitely a skill that a leader would have to develop. So that's a great. Those were some absolutely great insights. Thank you so much, Jared, for sharing them, and thank you for all the experiences that you really brought to life with, your descriptions of them, and kind of having us almost revisit the places you've been, the things you've done, through your memories and through talking about them. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to share.